Good evening, and welcome to the Autism Blogcast. I'm Jim Mancini.
And I'm Rafe Bernier. We focus tonight on responding to questions from our viewers.
First question. Dear Jim and Rafe, you've talked a lot about studies on the genetics in autism, but you haven't said much about the studies on the environment in autism. Why is that?
Jim, what do you think? Can I give my 90-minute response or my 90-second response?
Let's go with the 90-second.
Okay, all right, we'll go with 90 seconds. Well, that's a great question and a complicated one. First, I'll just say that we know that genetics plays a very strong role in autism, and we've known that for decades now. And that's part of the reason why we've been focusing on reporting on some of the genetic findings, because that's really where we're making major advances just in the past 10 years. With environmental contributions to autism, the story's a little bit more tricky and a little more complex. Some of the risk factors that have been identified include things like perinatal complications. These might be hypoxic events where the baby isn't able to get enough oxygen during the birth process, or prenatal complications, things like significant infections for the mom during pregnancy, or exposures to certain things like medications, specifically valproic acid, this type of anti-seizure medication. So those type of prenatal complications have been also presented as potential risk factors. What makes it complicated is that there's many children who have autism who did not have those exposures, and there's many individuals who have those exposures who don't develop autism. And on top of that, it seems like the recent research is suggesting that a lot of those exposures are connected with genetics. So it really highlights that it's complicated. And so we've been reporting on those major findings, which happen to be in genetics of recent, but we will continue to report on anything that ties to the causes of autism here in our blogcast.
All right.
Great. Okay, great. Question number 2. Let's do here. Dear Jim and Rafe, we are new to autism and our child was recently diagnosed. How do we determine where our child is on the spectrum?
Oh, a great question, and probably the number one question we receive here at the Autism Center. And a really tough question because the spectrum is so wide, and there's so much variability, and people usually change over time, especially after, prior to receiving services. A good way to think about it might be to look at the two main components of autism, that social communication and the repetitive behaviors often associated with rigidity or inflexibility, and observe to see if one seems to be sort of the bigger obstacle. Thinking about obstacles to development and really taking a look at your child's development can be really helpful because it allows you to think about and plan for what kind of treatments you might provide. For example, if language and communication was the primary obstacle, you might look into some additional speech and language therapy. If it was behavior, you might consider an ABA program. If anxiety, then you might look into counseling or medication. So it's kind of a tricky question. Hopefully that would help.
Great.
All right, question number 3.
Okay.
Dear Jim and Rafe, there are differences in prevalence rates for autism in different places. Why is that? Is that related to the number of professionals in the tech industry?
Another one I'd love to give a 90-minute answer if I could, Jim. No,
right.
Okay. Well, that's another tricky one to answer. So, first of all, I'll say what the research seems to suggest is that the difference in prevalence rates for autism are most likely associated with awareness and availability or access to services, such that places where there are services available for diagnosis and for treatment and where there's increased awareness about autism, we're going to tend to see higher prevalence rates. Now, what that question alludes to is the observation that sometimes parents of individuals with autism have traits that are associated with autism, but don't meet diagnostic criteria for autism.
Right.
And some of those traits actually are very beneficial and help support people become very successful in particular careers, such as the tech industry. So there's been some research to suggest that maybe that's related to autism. If parents have traits that are related to autism, we might have more greater likelihood to see autism. Therefore, in places where there's people with those traits that gather together, we tend to see higher prevalence rates of autism. Well, it gets complicated because some of those places, like Seattle and San Francisco, high-tech industry locations, also have access to services and increased awareness.
Right.
So it's tricky to disentangle. It's a great question. More research needs to be done.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
All right.
Okay, let's see. Question 4. Dear Jim and Rafe, first of all, I love your show.
Nice.
Thank you so much for providing this information in a clear and sometimes humorous way. Sometimes. My question is, what is up with the bright red ties? It's very reminiscent of you-know-who. Thanks, Kylie from Seattle.
All right, well, dear Kylie, first of all, thanks so much for your comments and support. Now, and secondly, no one owns the red tie. In fact, we're going to try to take the red tie back, despite the red tie being associated with conspiracy theories that have linked autism to vaccinations. The appointment of a Secretary of Education who has rolled back civil rights for students, and a push to repeal acts that provide important health care to the majority of citizens with disabilities in the United States. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention the events that the red tie has been associated with, a failure to condemn some of the events that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia earlier this month. Now, there's a long history of hatred and intolerance towards people who are different, whether it's their race or their religion, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, or having a disability. Seeing the Nazi flags walking through the streets of Charlottesville earlier this month, we should all be reminded that people with disabilities have often been targeted by hate groups. Over 200,000 people with physical and mental disabilities or mental health issues were exterminated in Nazi Germany between 1940 and 1945. Though autism wasn't a diagnosis at that time, we can assume that a certain number of individuals with autism could be included in that number. More recently, there have been hateful social media posts directed towards people with autism, inaccurately linking autism to mass shootings, with one post citing, quote, "the soulless dead eyes of the autistic children who are cold, calculating killing machines with no regard for human life."
Yeah, so misinformation like that only spreads more fear and hate. And when hatred's allowed to spread and is directed towards specific groups of people and becomes acceptable, well, we all need to pay attention and step up, speak out against that. So what I'd like to propose is that we take back the red tie. And I propose that this should represent acceptance, unity, support for everyone, regardless of ability or race, ethnicity, orientation, what have you. So let's take back the red tie.
Let's take it back.
All right.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next month.